Did you know? Much like how some Game Boy games have bonus content when played on a Game Boy Color, several Color games unlock special features when played on a Game Boy Advance. 4 examples of this are Shantae, Wendy, Every Which Way, and both The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and Seasons. When played on a GBA, Shantae has new items and abilities, Wendy, Every Which Way has 3 new levels, and the Oracle's games unlock a special Advance shop where players can buy exclusive items. These last 2 games even comment on the obscurity of the bonus content, with the store's owner Stockwell telling the player, "I'm amazed you found us." The success of the Game Boy line meant it penetrated pop culture and reached new audiences. In 1991, the system found its way to NBA star Lionel Simmons, who developed tendinitis in his right arm due to excessive amounts of Game Boy play. Simmons had to miss 2 basketball games while he was in recovery from hardcore gaming. The Game Boy was popular with more than just athletes, it was also popular with astronauts. The Game Boy was even the first gaming console played in outer space. The system, loaded with a copy of Tetris, was played by Russian cosmonaut Alexander Serebrov. He sent the device back to Earth with a note saying, "During flight, in rare minutes of leisure, I enjoyed playing Game Boy." The console, game, and note were sold in a charity auction for $1,220 in May 2011. Overall, Serebrov's Game Boy spent 196 days in space, orbiting the Earth over 3,000 times. Nintendo's Game Boy released in 1989 and was designed by industry veteran Gunpei Yokoi. Yokoi began developing the system in 1986, but the console's origins date all the way back to 1979. That year, on a train ride home, Yokoi saw a businessman playing with a pocket calculator, randomly pressing buttons to pass the time. It was in that moment Yokoi saw the utility of a handheld video game. At the time, Nintendo almost exclusively made toys, and had only experimented in the video game market with their Color TV game system. But Yokoi had designed several successful toys for Nintendo, and his ideas held a lot of weight at the company. In 1980, Nintendo released Ball, the first title in Yokoi's Game & Watch series, and Nintendo's very first handheld video game. It used a custom-printed LCD screen designed to show predefined characters and objects. Predefined art circumvented the need for dynamic displays using pixels. This saved on the amount of processing power the game needed, and allowed for the handheld to be made using inexpensive components. Other handheld electronic games from that era were mostly card games or sports games, so the Game & Watch series was viewed as a creative new approach with broader appeal. Over the course of 11 years, 59 different Game & Watch titles were produced, selling over 43 million units worldwide. The multi-screen series of the Game & Watch games even inspired the creation of the Nintendo DS. The 1982 port of Donkey Kong for Game & Watch was the first video game to feature the cross-shaped directional pad, or D-pad control scheme. The D-pad earned a Technology and Engineering Emmy Award, and was later patented by Nintendo and used in the NES and Game Boy. The Game Boy was internally called the DMG, or dot matrix game. Even though more advanced technology was available, the Game Boy's hardware was chosen to be cost-efficient and use as little power as possible, just like the Game & Watch. The LCD screen of the Game Boy was given a blank green background because, in testing, green contrasted better with the LCD overlay in different levels of light. Yokoi has called his design philosophy lateral thinking of withered technology. Withered technology refers to technology that is older, cheaper, and well understood, and lateral thinking refers to using that old technology in new and innovative ways. The price point and battery life of the Game Boy gave Nintendo an edge over more powerful handheld systems like the Atari Lynx and the Sega Game Gear, both of which came out around the same time as the Game Boy. Sega in particular seemed to resent the success of the Game Boy, and opened one of their Game Gear commercials by showing a Game Boy and stating, "If you were colorblind and had an IQ of less than 12, then you wouldn't mind which portable you had." During the Gulf War, one American soldier's Game Boy withstood an explosion during a bombing raid. The system suffered cosmetic damage, but was still operational. It was even displayed at the Nintendo store in New York City for several years. The Game Boy also crossed cultural boundaries despite government bans. After World War II, South Korea placed an embargo on Japanese products. So in 1990, instead of Nintendo selling the device, Korean company Hyundai did, renaming it the Mini Comboy. Hyundai sold several Japanese consoles under alternative names during this time, including the Genesis, NES, Master System, Game Gear, and Super Nintendo. The first backlit Game Boy wasn't the Game Boy Advance SP, but the Game Boy Light. The Game Boy Light was released in Japan in 1998 and was never sold in any other region. Nintendo had been working on a new Game Boy before the Light was even announced, as early as 1995. It was codenamed Project Atlantis and was based on a 32-bit processor. Magazines at the time suggested it was capable of running Super Nintendo standard games, and rumored that it'd be released in 1997. By the time 1997 came around, though, the console was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Nintendo released the Game Boy Color in 1998 as a stopgap so developers could spend more time working on Project Atlantis, which became the Game Boy Advance. Even though the Game Boy Color was only a modest upgrade over the previous Game Boy, it did add more than just color. The CPU was twice as fast, and it had 4 times the memory of the Game Boy. Another interesting fact is that in the Game Boy Color logo, each letter of the word color represents one of the 5 colors the system originally launched in. Throughout the life of the Game Boy Color, Nintendo experimented with ideas that would become basic features in later hardware releases. The Color was the first gaming handheld to offer wireless communication. The system had an infrared communications port at the top, which used the same technology found in a TV remote. Though it was more primitive than modern wireless connectivity, it was still capable of trading information in games like Pokémon and Harry Potter. The Game Boy Color was also the first Nintendo handheld to have a motion-controlled game. Kirby's Tilt and Tumble was controlled almost entirely by a series of accelerometers that were built into the cartridge, which was a first for video games. The original Game Boy line, including the Game Boy Color, sold 118.69 million units worldwide, and with this success came many innovative and unique peripherals for the Game Boy line of handhelds. There was also a sewing machine that had compatibility with the Game Boy. The Singer iSec sewing machine connected to the game via link cable and allowed users to design patterns with a special game cartridge. Another obscure accessory for the Game Boy was the iCard cartridge. It was a radio transmitter that would use the Game Boy to display real-time information about times, scores, schedules, and results for the American Le Mans Series races. In 1998, Nintendo released the Game Boy Camera and Game Boy Printer. The Game Boy Camera held the world record of being the smallest digital camera of its time. Singer-songwriter Neil Young released the album Silver and Gold in the year 2000. The album's cover photo was taken with a Game Boy camera. The Game Boy camera also had a few Easter eggs. If the player presses B during the credits sequence, a short video of Shigeru Miyamoto dancing will play. The Game Boy Printer also has an Easter egg. If the device is turned on while the user holds the feed button, an image of Mario with the word hello will be printed on the paper. Nintendo also sold a special Zelda edition of the Game Boy camera through the Nintendo Power magazine. The cartridge was gold rather than black, and many of the graphics and clip art from the original were replaced with Zelda graphics. Another special edition of the Game Boy camera was never released. It was based around the characters and images from the Japanese magazine CoroCoro Comics. Even though it was never released, much of the unique content from this version still exists in the ROM of the original Japanese Game Boy camera. Also on the Japanese version, there's a print icon that shows a syringe. This is because many older printers use syringes to refill their inkjets. However, syringes are often associated with drug use in the West, so the icon was replaced with a Game Boy Printer icon in the international versions. Another Game Boy accessory was the Super Game Boy. Super Game Boy was an adapter for the Super Nintendo to play Game Boy games on the TV. What's interesting about the device is that the Super Nintendo didn't have the ability to emulate Game Boy games. Instead, the Super Game Boy itself contained most of the same hardware that was in an actual Game Boy, minus the screen and buttons. Another Game Boy peripheral of sorts was the Game Link cable. The Link cable impacted the world even beyond video games, as it was the basis for Apple's FireWire connectors. Two more bizarre Game Boy peripherals are the Pocket Sonar and the Petty Sedate. The Game Boy Pocket Sonar was made by Bandai for the original Game Boy, and used sonar to locate underwater fish. It was the first sonar-based gaming accessory and retailed in Japan for 14,800 yen, about $115 at the time. It even had a built-in fishing minigame. The Petty Sedate, on the other hand, would connect to a Game Boy device and dole out nitrous oxide to the children playing. Its general purpose was to reduce stress when children needed to be sedated. One unreleased Game Boy accessory was shown by DSi designer Masato Kuwahara at the 2009 Game Developers Conference. It was a touch panel that went over the screen of the Game Boy Color. It was abandoned because it apparently didn't work well without a backlight. The touch panel was attempted again with the Game Boy Advance SP, and operated more favorably because of its backlit screen. Kuwahara stated the touch panel was not well received by Nintendo management, but that Shigeru Miyamoto liked the general concept. Masato Kuwahara said he likes to think his design helped influence the creation of the Nintendo DS. Did you also know that the Pokémon anime's creators always wanted Pokémon to talk, but the idea wasn't realized until the creation of Detective Pikachu? Or that the Pokémon anime was censored many times and saw several changes in the Western release? For more facts, watch the Did You Know Movies videos on Detective Pikachu and the Pokémon anime.